Okay, so test on Thursday, I will have, in case you're unsurprised, I'm recording these as videos, so you will have the videos for the last classes updated online, so you can use those as a study guide. Important thing when you do the efficiency template, you will do the efficiency template, you will need a calculator. That will be important. And one of the things that questions is going to be, does it make sense? And I'm giving you the answer right now, okay? This is the answer I want you to have. And I think it's so important that you understand this, that I'm willing to give you the 5 points just so you get it right, okay? So you do the efficiency template, you do the calculations, that's 15 points from the essay. And then another 5 questions is going to be, does this make sense? And the answer is yes, because the normative profit share equals the effort and value of each channel partner. And that's what the normative profit share is. Now, you'll probably not have end users. You'll probably have a calculation similar to the one we're doing in terms of building materials. You might even be a multiple users or a contractor. So the numbers are going to come out different. But I want you to take in and understand what the efficiency template is trying to give you. And I think it's so important that I'm willing to give you 5 points. Okay. So that's the answer. Okay. So the test, I'll go over very quickly and I'll go over it before we leave. The test will be 30 questions, multiple guesses, equally from each chapter. The efficiency template will be mandatory. The calculations will be worth 15 points. That extra question will be worth 5. That's half of the essay questions right there. So that's 20 points. Even if you get an error, just do the calculations, okay? I will give you credit. Please try. You will have 4 essay questions. After that, you choose 2. And yes, remember the members of the channel system, and remember that the end user is there. And why is the end user part of the channel system and marketing channels? Somebody, please. Why is an end user a member of the channel system? Because they, somebody please, give me redemption, okay? They perform channel functions, okay? Yes, that's all you have to say, okay? Thank you. I can go home now. All right. Okay. I know, it's 2 in the afternoon. You're kind of relaxing. Yep, sorry. So remember that. It's going to be a question, okay? Did I say that too strongly? I hope so. So, just a little more, just remember about the values of the efficiency template, what it's for, what it brings you, its importance, and why we do this. And then realize that this is built upon the equity principle, which basically says that a member's compensation should reflect their participation. And that's exactly what the normative profit share calculates you. Because what it ultimately is trying to do is give you a justification for making change. What does all this folderol mean? Well, one of the things that when I talked about, if you remember, one of the laws that I put up is that because of the nature of marketing channels and the amount of effort and the amount of cost that it does, that there's a danger for performing unnecessarily well. And if you remember that, why did I state that? Well, this goes along with the concept of the zero-based channel. And so what does the zero-based channel mean? The zero-based channel says that I can perform all my service outputs, all the necessary channel functions at a minimum cost, or as they state, a zero cost. So that's what the zero-based channel concept is. I can do everything that's possible, and I do it at the lowest possible cost. Now, there is one cost which is the most flexible, and that is inventory. And so generally, when I'm talking about creating a zero-based channel, it means that inventory is going to be the one thing that I try to manipulate the most. Controlling cost often depends on reducing inventory. I read a fascinating article after the test I'll read to you. So Amazon is going to a full-featured channel service, which I knew they eventually would. Anyway, but how do we control this inventory? Well, there are many obvious ways. One of them is that you try to avoid items that sell slowly unless these items are not susceptible to waste or obsolescence. Okay. Obsolescence, by the way, means that that thing functions perfectly well, but something else replacing just simply does it better. Obsolescence is different from being obsolete. Obsolete is like using whale bones for women's corsets. That's obsolete. Okay. So you want to avoid things that become obsolescent. There's always a danger of technology, especially when I worked in computers. You couldn't go 6 months with the latest and the greatest. You try to find and lengthen the life of goods. Usually you're talking about goods that are shelf stable and that won't change, or consistent over a time, or you try to find a vendor who can resupply that as fast as possible. Reliable vendors are golden. The other thing that you can do is, if you're Walmart, you can reduce variety. It makes it easier to deal with 3 or 4 vendors for their foods versus 2 or 3 dozen. Now, aiming for a zero-based channel in the presence of uncertainty is a key goal, but it's one of those things that tends to be very difficult, to the point impossible, because as we minimize inventory, if you remember those, supply and demand is uncertain, we have the danger of the bullwhip effect. And so on your little sheet on Tuesday, or last Thursday, excuse me, the bullwhip effect just basically means as I said, is that a small change in demand creates huge ripples in supply. Okay. When you move from the end user to the wholesaler to the manufacturer, this is the net effect when you guess wrong. But that's the nature of the game, and that's the way we play it. Because all corporations, whether they think of doing it or not, whether they've ever heard this concept, the key control of inventory is based around this concept: zero-based channel. Now, what's the truth? May not exist. It's very likely that you may face some managerial issues, and in other words, there are things might be inside your corporation which require you to do things in a certain way that you have no control over. You know, you might have a senior operator who says, we're going to stack these until the day we die, and so you have no way of controlling that. Managerial barriers are barriers that happen within organizations. All right. Those can be just standard procedures that you cannot get around. That can be an example. Environmental barriers can be just simply the cost of trying to bring one item from one place to the next. It's one of the issues, as I've said before, living in Boone is almost like living on an island in a way. You got to be coming here to get here. I mean, we're not on the lane to any directions. And just the simple transportation costs more. That's simple. I don't know about you, but I get a little nervy watching those 18-wheelers go around the curves. So the truth is, if you see a question that says zero-based is possible, may not even be real, but you shoot for it anyway. So the last thing we want to talk about is that given the zero-based channels, given consumer demand, because demand is always uncertain, do gaps exist? In other words, are we ever perfectly aligned? And the answer is no. Usually this is because the businesses have not thought about how to target end users' demands for service outputs or the cost of running the channel itself. We tend to just take things, stack them on the floor, and expect consumers to simply come in and pick them up. That's not how it works, okay? If we don't have a good idea of how consumers want things and where they want them, then this is what brings about gaps in service and gaps in cost. We can do too little or we can do too much, depending on whether or not we accurately define consumer demands. There are also environmental and managerial bounds that can also create these gaps as well. And so what is a managerial bound? A managerial bound is basically a constraint that is imposed inside the organization itself. An environmental bound is a constraint that is composed inside the organization itself. And so I can give you an example. True story. A manufacturer of tablets, not iPads, not Samsung tablets, but just general tablets, was having difficulty because people were returning their tablets simply because the screen resolution wasn't that great. So this got management upset. And so management said, we will not accept returns for anything other than broken tablets. So what do you think started happening? Yes, they broke them. Exactly. Oh, I can't return it unless it's broken. I want to return it. That's exactly what happened. And so that's an example of a managerial putting of that. An environmental bound is an imposition that happens outside the organization. Tariffs, quotas. You cannot sell certain versions of the iPhones inside China. They're made only for export use. That would be an example. And so you know what happens? We'll talk about this. We talk about gray market and arbitrages. But what happens is that there's corporations on Taiwan that buy hundreds of thousands of iPhones and ship them right back into China. That's the way the world works. But that is an environmental bound. Okay, it's outside the corporation itself. It's an imposition by a government body. And so, because we haven't thought of the consumers well enough, we have these gaps. And so the first one we're going to talk about is service gaps. And we'll talk about these one at a time, and I'll show you examples. So the first service gap is when consumers desire services that are not supplied. So the service supplied is less than the service demanded. Consumers want more service. And so let me give you my own personal example. The amount of service supplied is less than the service demanded. And so this is my example. Okay, this is the first gap. So way back when I was younger than you, I used to listen to 45s. Now, albums or vinyl comes from basically the recording that is set in the vinyl. Okay, original long playing large albums were 78s, and that's because they spun on the turntable 78 revolutions a minute. Okay, so that's where they call them 78s. They had to spin them that fast because they couldn't put enough of the signal dense enough inside the big albums. Well, they got better at it. The long playing albums, the LPs, started spinning at 33 1/3, which meant you could put 45 minutes on a single side if you wanted to. Okay. Along with that, in the 50s, you started to see the advent of what was called the 45. And it was called the 45 because it spun at 45 revolutions a minute. If you have a turntable, you'll notice it has an arm that says 78, 45, 33 1/3, and that's the reason why you set it for 45 for this. Now, in the mid-50s, they started doing what was called top 40. And so American Billboard started listing the 40 highest grossing records, individual records that week. Didn't matter what genre it came from. It could be country, it could be pop, it could be rock, it could be anything. And that's where top 40 came from. And it all came from how many of these that they could sell in a given week. And so me as an individual, I spent more time buying singles than I did buying LPs. I started getting LPs when I started getting into Pink Floyd, Jethro Tull and the rest, Led Zeppelin. But anyway, I would do this because I wanted singles. I wanted one individual. So if you notice, this is a vinyl record. It has an A side and a B side to it. So the A side was the record of choice. The B side was a filler song, wouldn't really matter. There's a whole series of what's called B-side hits. You can go look at them on YouTube. Kung Fu Fighting was a B-side wonder. Okay, so they'll give you an idea. So they had these large circles. I don't know why, but you had to go buy these plastic things, put in the middle. You'd put it on the spinner, you'd put 10 or 15 on a line, and that's how I listened to music. That's how I listened while I worked and did my homework. And so I could listen to a single tune, one after another, after another, after another. Well, in the 70s and the 80s, you started to see the advent of compact discs. Compact discs were great. They didn't scratch like vinyl. But the problem with compact discs is they did not do singles. Singles as a genre started going away, which was pretty crappy, all right? I mean, it meant that I couldn't enjoy the music the way I liked it. And so there was more of us. Well, around the 70s, you started to see MP3 compression starting. That, yes, of course, vinyl has much greater clarity, recorded in analog than digital does. But hey, who cares? You get your music. Well, around this time, around the 90s, dial-up internet came along, and you saw this company called Napster. Has anybody heard of Napster? It's 30 years ago. I mean, I can't believe I'm sitting here. It's 30 years ago, but it was, okay? So Napster came along, and Napster said, take your music, put it on your record player. Computers were big then. You had your ports into your Sound Blaster cards. You started converting your records into MP3s, and then you'd load up Napster, which was a sharing software, okay? A sharing software. And this is what you do. You hook up your dial-up at night when your parents went to bed, and from midnight to 6 a.m. in the morning, hopefully dad doesn't wake up and knock off your phone, but these are the records that you had in queue for somebody else to get, and these are the ones you're downloading at that time. That's how it worked. Well, the record industry said, you know, that's royally illegal. And they said, yeah, it is. But the fact is, quite simply, it was a product of its time. the service supplied was less than the service demanded, and consumers found an answer. And so now we have digital, and now we have singles. Once again, it should be noted that, Apple, their service, Apple's service, when it came out for singles, cleared $1 billion in its first year. And that, in essence, it paid everything off and made $1 billion, which shows you that people were starved for this kind of thing. Okay? All right. So there is the service supplied that is less than the service demanded. Next one is the amount of service supplied is greater than the amount demanded. Well, that's not bad. You're given more than you should. It's not bad, right? Well, the problem is that if you're in business, you're basically investing too much. And as a matter of fact, consumers may not like having so many service outputs. It may actually get in their way. And so the amount of service supplied can be greater than the service demanded. And my example are record stores. Now, there's one on King Street now, which is great. But record stores mostly are a form of nostalgia now, to be honest, okay? Record stores are great. I love them. I used to spend hours in them. But you have to realize at a certain point in the 70s and 80s, there was a record store in every town, just to give you an idea how popular record stores were. In bigger cities, you might have 3 or 4 of them. This is one in New York. If you'll notice, they actually had where you could take an LP, you could put it on the record player, and you could sit in a private listening booth to hear the record. In the 60s and then in the 70s, they started moving because at that point they was just started at the beginning, and you saw record stores start to gravitate to blacklight posters and head shops and those kind of things, trying to be able to find some other revenue stream to augment what was happening to the records. Didn't work. The other alternative I might also say is Blockbuster, which I've talked about here before. Blockbuster used to be the Friday night place to go. I mean, you used to have lines outside of the Blockbuster waiting, hoping that one of those 35 separate copies of Rambo is still there. And if I can get that, then get my popcorn and everything else, I can get out of here in at least 45 minutes if I'm lucky. And ultimately, what we found was a little red box called Redbox did everything that consumers wanted, because really what consumers wanted is to get it now and get out. And that was what happened. And eventually, Blockbuster, literally over 5 years, ceased to exist. Well, it still exists. There's 2 stores in the world left. One in Washington, one in Florida. So this is an example of service supplied is greater than service demanded. The other gap to talk about is cost gap. Now, cost gap and service demanded or service supplied is greater than, less than the service demanded. They kind of follow each other, because when you're quite simply spending too much, this is one of the more dangerous aspects, especially if you've got a lot of money. So they use this discussion point here with CDW. So CDW spent quite a bit of money on their new hire sales program. Very rigorous training, but their turnover rate was 25%, which meant that 1 out of 4 salespeople would leave in less than a year. They found that to be very cost inefficient. And they found that those particular training costs were wasted investments. Probably the biggest thing, just me saying, is probably they did not, and I really don't know, but they probably didn't offer some kind of profit sharing with the sales that you made. That's what drives salespeople. All right. So I'm just guessing that. Cost gaps only exist one way. Cost gaps only exist when you're spending too much money. There is no such thing as a cost gap if you can perform all the channel functions, satisfy consumers with your service outputs, and do it at a low cost. That's not a gap, that's a win. And so cost gaps only go one way, okay? You don't have to memorize this. This is kind of a little sheet here, and it can be a little bit confusing, but basically just remember, service gaps can be both ways. Cost gaps only one. So, how do we go about trying to fix these gaps? Well, it depends on the corporation, depends on the issue. But there are either two ways that you can do it. One way is postponement, where you put off incurring costs as long as possible. And the other is speculation, where you do things in anticipation. So an example, Delta Airlines puts a lot of money into the refining of all of its jet fuel, tries to get as many costs incurred beforehand. And that includes speculation. So, I mean, you're betting that the costs now are going to be better than the costs later. Postponement is when you put them off as long as possible, but it doesn't mean that postponement is delay. That's not what it means. I had this discussion with my graduate students last night in the very same frame, is that the status quo is not making no decision. You might very well decide that given the way things are, the best place to be is where you are at this moment. There's a big difference between that and avoid making a decision entirely. So postponement means that based upon your best efforts now, you figure, I'm going to do better later on than now. And so this is where Southwest, they deal with postponement. They don't worry about their fuel costs until later, and then they aggressively tackle those issues. They only have 30% of their fuel banked at any one time, and they're always willing to speculate on the spot market. That sounds quick, but so what are the preferences? Well, end users usually engage in postponement. I know I always do. I mean, I've never been the first one in line for anything. Cheap that way, I guess. I like to buy my books when they hit the bargain basement. But book publishers, based upon their nature, have to favor speculation because they have to print in order to get the goods or the goods available. But end users are willing to speculate if they find a good price. And so what is the inherent risk? The inherent risk with postponement is you're going to miss a good deal. The difficulty with speculation is that you pull the trigger too quick. And so what are the inherent costs? So for speculation, I think I said this before, I went out and proactively, a house was going into bankruptcy and I threw out a cost and it was accepted so readily, I realized I left money on the table. And so that's speculation. Postponement basically means that you put off to the very end, and then all of a sudden the intensity of demand picks up, and then in essence, you get wiped out. So I was waiting for the price for a Gab watch for my daughter to drop. And then what happened is it was sold out before school season, and now I gotta wait. And so those are the difficulties on postponement and speculation. Postponement is the hope that goods will be better or more available in the future, whereas speculation says that the best time is now. You do not have to worry about gap analysis. It will not be on the test, so we're going to go through that. And we're done. That's it for the day. So let me go over one more time before the test. 30 questions, multiple guess, one or each equally from each chapter, 20 points on the efficiency template, 15 points for the calculation, 5 points for the question. 4 essay questions, choose 2. And please remember why the end user is part of the channel. Somebody say it one more time. Because. Thank you. I can go home. Okay. Yes.
So I just have a quick question. So like with the multiple choice questions and the short answer questions, what might they look
Okay.
like what are they gonna say? I guess so. Like,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
So a third of the multiple choice questions are easy questions. You're just going to recite definitions. Okay, there will be no short answer. Okay, they'll just be essays.
Okay.
Oh, the essay questions, by the way, you don't have to write War and Peace. Just tell me what the answer is. Okay, so that's the essay questions. No, God, no. I can't read that. Essay questions.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
But the multiple guess, simple definition. There will be reflective learning questions in which you'll be given an example and said, this is a blank. And then maybe a quarter of them are going to be hard. Okay. And so that's the way I do my essay question. Okay. Yes.
Do you curve at all?
Yeah. But I curve at the end. Okay. So my curving happens once all of the things are in. And I see all these smiling faces that are here every day, and I'm looking at it, and you got an 88, you are here every day, and I draw a line below the 88, and I say everything above is an A, and everything below is B, and that's how I do this stuff. Okay? All right. You bet. Good luck.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
Have a good one. See you, Peter.